Hello and welcome to this webinar. Thank you for joining us. So we will give about 1 to 2 minutes to allow people join in and settle, and we will start. Please let us know where you are joining us from. Feel free to use the chat, your name, your organization, and the city you're joining us from. Thank you. Thank you all for joining in. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you're joining us from. Welcome to this webinar, which is a virtual launch event for a series of country reports titled From Climate Risk to Resilience, Unpacking the Economic Impact of Climate Change. This is hosted by the African Climate Foundation and the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI. So thank you once again for joining us. And over the next 2 hours, we will be having various segments where we will dive into first an opening remarks by Salim Fakir, who is the executive director of the ACF. And we move into a spotlight on the findings, key findings of the country report. And we'll also have a presentation by the ACF and also IFPRI on their work on climate adaptation in Africa. And lastly, there will be a panel session from top government officials and sector experts moderated by Alan Wallace of the ACF. And this will give insight onto how we can strengthen funding and scaling climate adaptation to address climate risk in Africa. So thank you once again for joining us. I am Wale Amond. I work with the ACF, and feel free to use the chat box. In case you've not been able to access the report, a link will be shared with you shortly. Feel free to download and take a look at the report. So without much ado, I will invite Salim Fakir, Executive Director of the African Climate Foundation, for his opening remarks. Please
Thank
welcome
you.
Salim.
Thank you, Wale. I just want to thank you and the participants, and just to say a few things about provide context for this particular endeavor. I do think the reports are an instrument to foster a conversation around adaptation and resilience, and particularly the investment platforms that the African Climate Foundation is looking to promote. So we are not only gravitating to understanding some case studies to illustrate some of the challenges that we have on the continent in dealing with climate risk, and particularly dealing with climate risk in a systematic and in a way that is strategic, and also tries to bring about a response that is of much larger scale than just a project by project basis. So we had over the last year a fantastic collaboration with the International Food Policy Research Institute, and I will give my thank yous later once I've just made some opening remarks. And that's got to do with the fact that IFPRI has a long track record for doing amazing climate modeling work, also very concentrated and focused on key important economic sectors, which is agriculture on this continent, but being able to overlay on the modeling work or climate modeling work, also some economic analysis and modeling. And I think all of that brought together begins to tell a story and about not simply the scientific aspects of climate risk, but also draws us into discussion about the macro and micro implications of climate risk. So why are we doing this? And it's really, we have done a bit of homework. We have talked to many players on the continent. We are not looking to repeat what other people do, but really to complement and to enhance and support existing work that is already happening on the ground. And I think it is fair to say that there's a lot of work going on across the continent with very scarce and limited resources, both by governments and non-state actors. And we know the economic impacts are quite significant. In some cases, the impacts on GDPs can be as high as between 3 to 10%, depending on which economies one talks about and the degree of vulnerability to these risks. So the role of ACF is really to try to establish more larger scale political and technical mechanisms to identify non-project based approaches to funding, particularly mobilizing larger scale funding beyond what we have been able to secure at the moment. And this is not just public funding, but also being able to mobilize funding from government fiscal programs, if we can improve fiscal resilience, but also funding from private sector that are impacted by climate risks, particularly in key economic or anchor economic sectors that are vital to national economies and for ongoing business enterprises that are subject to ongoing frequent climate risk as we move forward. So our concern is around scalable finance, like we have seen for JETPs. We want to do that for adaptation, resilience investment platforms. The second area is around fiscal stability. And the third is being able to mobilize non-public based resources for key economic sectors. So our motivation for publishing these country reports, particularly the 4 that you will hear about soon, is to do some basic baseline, robust evidence-based work to demonstrate that there are opportunities and solutions and that we can avoid some of these risks if we are smarter about them and if we find the right policy and fiscal and other financial tools to avoid conditions of maladaptation. They also demonstrate these reports that there's ongoing work that is being undertaken, and there's some real far-reaching, innovative programs in place already, and all that needs to be done is to be able to work in a complementary way and enhance the enabling conditions for that work to go on further. The reports themselves are going to be used by ACF and our partners, IFPRI, and many others, including national governments. You will hear from some of them just now, to work with other international partners to mobilize the right quantum of funding to be able to support the work that is already going on the ground. And finally, I think we must see the reports as providing guidance rather than firm pointers, and really opportunities to open our minds to other opportunities and areas of exploration that we would like to undertake in partnership with some of the countries we are in consultation with that are looking to take a lead on this. Just finally, I want to thank Eva, Wally, and Alan, all of whom have put enormous amount of work into this. I don't even know how they've managed to do that in such a short space of time. Definitely the IFPRI team, Channing, and your team, Channing, and I'm sure you'll introduce some of them. And finally, for Kelly and Lucas to put this event together. I think they've been harassed over the last 2 months, but not in a troublesome way, but in a pleasant way, to get this off the ground. And I'm really pleased that we have got here and we've got amazing work to showcase. But just finally to say, it's not just about the reports, but really about doing stuff on the ground. And we hope that the reports will open the space for that. Thanks.
Thank you, Salim, for thank you for your wonderful remarks. And now it's time to delve into the report, and this will show us the key findings from the 4 countries. And I have Eva Deslenova, who is the Senior Advisor on Climate Adaptation for the ACF, Askar Mukasov, who works with IFPRI, Joanne Tian, and Faika Atli, who also work with IFPRI. So Eva, over to you.
Thank you very much, Wally, and hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As the next slide shows, we have just published 4 reports covering Zambia, Malawi, Mozambique, and Kenya. And Wally, can you please put also links into the chat, so if people haven't had a chance to look at the reports, they can download them after this webinar. I really encourage, of course, reading the reports. There is a lot of detail and a lot of interesting comparisons between different estimates and different studies that show you the complexity of climate adaptation in Africa, and also to what extent there is consensus and where sometimes there isn't, which creates further risks and challenges for policymakers. We have picked those 4 countries for various reasons, but among that is the fact that they each tell quite a different story and different challenges, and that's what we will try to summarize at a high level now. So going to the next slide, I'm going to start with Zambia, and I'm going to let the others to represent the other countries. So the next slide shows the overall projection of the way climate change is expected to change Zambia's climate profile. Most models suggest that temperatures will increase across the country. Of course, how much will depend on the global mitigation efforts and in what future scenario we live in. But many models suggest that temperatures will rise by more than 1.5 degrees, by 2050, and possibly more, and towards 2 degrees in a high emission scenario. What is also very, very important is that there is a fair amount of consensus that the southern and southern-west parts of the country would be particularly affected. There is already drought-prone areas, and they are projected to see the most decline in precipitation. And you can see on the graph on the right, the red areas is where drought risk is particularly high. Moreover, water availability is projected to decrease at national level, but again, more in the south, where a lot of important rivers are located, important with economic implications. And finally, extreme weather events are also expected to increase both in frequency and intensity. So it really demonstrates the need for adaptation, but also to think through the differences in how various regions, and you can see the key ecological zones on the left side, and what it means for each of them. While it is overall a challenging picture, there are also some potential benefits, particularly for the northern parts of the country. So going to the next slide, we've tried to summarize across key economic sectors what the implications may be of these projections. And the sectors we've identified for Zambia to be most important from this perspective is agriculture, hydropower, and also the road infrastructure, given the knock-on effects. On agriculture, you can see on the table on the right projected crop yields, they vary by crop, they vary by region as well. And also it will depend on the amount of CO2 fertilization and other impacts. But overall, a lot of models suggest that maize is particularly vulnerable to climate change. This is really important because cereal crops like wheat and maize provide more than 60% of energy requirements in Zambia. So this could have implications for food security. Other major crops, as you can see, can also be quite affected. Moreover, because the southern and western regions are drying up more and getting hotter, the produce there is particularly affected, and this is putting a lot of vulnerable communities in a particularly difficult situation, especially as 80% of the communities there depend on subsistence farming. Moreover, they also produce a lot of the maize production in the country. The fact that the water availability is reducing is also going to pose challenges for adaptation measures that could otherwise be deployed, such as the use of irrigation. Moreover, the livestock subsector is also projected to be affected, especially due to the increase in temperatures and consecutive dry days. While the increase of flooding is going to pose more challenges to the road infrastructure. And here an added country-specific challenge is that a lot of to flooding. So that can have implications both for the national economy, but also for the ability of actually to reach their destination. And a moment on talking about the hydropower sector, which accounts of 85% of the installed capacity in the country. Most of it, all the major dams are located in the south. So this is a major challenge. And it is not an easy one to substitute, looking at the destinations from which Zambia often imports electricity when needed. It's generally an exporter, but when needed, it tends to import from neighboring countries like Malawi, Mozambique, and South Africa. We'll hear about the challenges there, but there is also a wrong-way risk in the fact that extreme weather events like droughts can affect on a regional basis. Now, all of this has both serious national and international implications. One of them is because of the very important copper sector. Copper accounts for about 70% of Zambia's foreign exchange earnings, but relies heavily on electricity for its production and export and transportation. Meanwhile, Zambia is it's the top row copper exporter and also within the top 10 of overall. This clearly could have implications for growth and for trade balance for the country, but it also has international implications. Copper is a very important element, but the demand is projected to increase globally because of its key role in mitigation efforts and green technologies. In fact, Standard & Poor's project that demand for copper could double by 2035. So really here is a great example of how helping Zambia adapt to the challenges it faces to ensure it has continuous access to electricity is something important for the country, but also for the world. The reports also speak about other broader macroeconomic vulnerabilities, the challenges that fluctuations in commodity prices and also food prices because of climate change can pose, as well as the challenges with Zambia's fiscal position, which undermine its ability to take adaptation measures and be proactive. On the next slide, you can see that that there is a lot of work that the government and supporting organizations have already done to develop the adaptation strategy and to embed those kind of considerations into policy more broadly, including the 8th National Development Policy, the revised NDC, and so on. There is also a national adaptation plan in development. There have also been efforts to develop more the finance market, including with guidelines and listing rules for green bonds, developing regulations for carbon markets, and so on. So there clearly is really good awareness and understanding of the importance of these climatic changes and the need to adapt the economy. But there are also significant challenges, including technical capacity, funding, the integration of national and subnational level, given the diverse regional impact of climate change, the availability of data, and so on. So going to the next slides, as Salim mentioned, we have identified some areas that we believe exploring further collaboration could help identify ways to advance the strategy development for adaptation and especially funding. In the case of Zambia, the fact that there is such a difference between the south-southwest impact versus the northeast side of the country suggests a need for rethinking how agriculture and the national level crop mix works, and whether there may be better conditions for certain crops in other areas of the country that incentives could be introduced to develop further. And more importantly, that adaptation measures in agriculture need to be region specific and take into account these granular projections for the climate impact. That will also require to think through the implications across different ministries. For example, thinking through the importance of a road infrastructure to agricultural productivity and how adaptation strategies in various sectors can benefit from more engagement and coordination. We also highlighted the importance of effective water resource management. And this is particularly important from the perspective of agricultural and energy adaptation policies, especially as some regions for agriculture are upstream to hydropower plants and it could further affect availability, as well as more broadly the need for the energy mix to diversify away from hydropower towards renewable energy and other sustainable sources of energy for the country in the new climate that it will face. We have also highlighted the need to prioritize mobilization of funding for improvements to road infrastructure. The report goes into quite a bit of detail and studies around the benefits of that, and including in terms of future-proofing the resilience of key roads and international trade corridors. And finally, and this is true across all the countries that we focused on, the need to think through the funding mechanism for adaptation and resilience in a way that supports the long-term development goals, that there is the context of the fiscal position of Zambia that needs to be taken into account, so that both adaptation and economic resilience are improved. I'm going to stop here, given the limited time we have. I'm going to pass on to my colleague, Aska, who's going to tell you more about the situation in Malawi. Thank you.
Thanks, Eva. So my name is Askar. Is there echo? I'm sorry. I work as an associate research fellow at the Foresight and Policy Modeling Unit at the IFPRI. I'm a CGIAR modeler. This model is responsible for economy-wide modeling that basically translates how various. Okay. Let me try. Give me a second, please. I'm very sorry. We tried and but let me. Hello? Okay, thank you. So I'm a CGIAR modeler, so I model I'm responsible for economy-wide type of modeling, where I basically translate how various policies or shocks, in this case climate, is translated into real-life repercussions in the production side of the economy or for the households. Let me summarize you our findings for Malawi. So, on average, our models suggest that climate change is not expected to significantly alter this country's profile, but this is on average. Now, but we also find that the uncertainty is actually increasing, and this is especially worrisome, given the increased probability of negative events. So, just to give you the gist of it, let me give you some unrelated example. So if I get the prediction that I'll live until 80 years old, plus minus 10 years. Now, imagine that for some reasons, unrelated exogenous factors that are out of my control, I get the new prediction that I will live until 80 years old on average still. But the uncertainty this time is wider. So I can live from 50 to 90 years with an average still being 80. So that's why, because it has significant risks for me, I will be particularly concerned about the left side of the prediction, so the negative outcomes. So in this case, droughts. So of all these graphs, probably what we should pay attention to two different climates on the medium lower side of the slide, medium graph. 2C is basically the global climate change scenario if the average increase on global temperature will be kept to 2 Celsius degree to pre-industrial level, and the PF, or is it, yeah, the Paris Forever is according to the Paris Climate Accord. And as we can see, most important takeaway from this relatively complicated graph is that the uncertainty range is widening. Now, if we take this uncertainty range and translate it into something more feasible that everyone can understand, and let's say frequency of 1 in 20 year low rainfall events. So on this bottom right graph, we see that what used to happen once in 20 years in many parts of the country, in fact, can happen 2 times, 3 times more frequent. So what used to be 1 in 20 year event now can happen every 8 year in certain parts of the country. In a small portion of the country, it will be still within the historical range. So that is green from 17 to 23, and another significant part of the country will basically have double increased probability of these rare events. If we go to the next slide, and on this slide, the key takeaway is basically table number 2, which gives us the change in increased probability of 1 in 20 year events for the key crops in Malawi under both low and high global climate change scenarios. And as we can see, the more severe climate change gets, the more frequent droughts can happen in Malawi. So in particular, if we look at the staple crop such as maize, we see that by the 2060s, the frequent 20-year droughts we can have, if the world follows high emissions scenario, this drought every 8 years. So now, if we translate this crop modeling into economic outcomes, according to our estimates, the severity of the economic shocks, so that is the basically GDP decline, increase in poverty when these events happen, linked tied to this drought-induced low events, could be by the 2040s, for example, 3 times higher than the similar events in the 2020s. Other key points our country's vulnerabilities on the macro level is basically low economic diversification, as secondary and tertiary sectors are in their infancy, basically. Unstable fiscal position, trade balance risks, underdeveloped financial system, and so on and so forth. Now, if we go to the next slide. The key takeaway from this slide is basically this graph. So there is basically a vulnerability score that ranks 5 countries in the world and their climate vulnerability. And as we can see, historically, Malawi has always been one of the most vulnerable countries, because out of 800 or 185 countries, it was always at the bottom. So at the top, meaning that it was one of the most vulnerable countries in the world. And it's no surprise in this context, given the historical what has been going on in the past, what is going on in the country now, and the future climate projections. It is no surprise that the government is taking measures to address climate impacts, and that it was one of the first African countries to launch a national climate change investment plan. And the priority areas there include early warning system, water, biodiversity, climate smart agriculture, climate-proofed infrastructure, health, disaster risk management. But the main challenges for the country remain, especially in funding those adaptation measures. Now, if we go to the next slide, we also did the study where we were comparing the country's 2 alternative development strategies, because if the country is significantly vulnerable to climate-associated risks, so maybe it should go with reducing the importance of agriculture in its economy by investing into country's industrialization, so it's no longer vulnerable to climate change. And according to our model results, no, reducing the importance or drifting away from agriculture is not really a feasible strategy, because actually investing in agriculture still, even under increasing of this option, is still optimal strategy for the country, because it's the fastest way to reduce poverty and undernourishment. So now, from macro level to more refined options, it is necessary to assess the costs and benefits of pursuing various climate adaptation measures, both within agriculture and in non-agriculture sectors. It's necessary then to adopt more transformative approach to climate adaptation, resilience, and yeah, funds mobilization then becomes very particularly important, and it is necessary to support the country, including production of an updated investment plans, which requires more research, more refined approach. Yeah, and the last, it is necessary to improve engagement and coordination in climate adaptation and resilience efforts, both domestically and on the international level. I think I'll stop here and hand to our next presenter. Thank you.
Hi, this is Junyan, who is a research analyst at International Food Policy Research Institute. I will present our climate change report for Mozambique. Can you allow me to start my camera? Can you allow me to open my camera? I think the host have stopped my camera. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Next slide, please. Yeah. The last 20 years have already witnessed the increased intensity in extreme events, including droughts, floods in Mozambique, and this trend is expected to continue, mostly affecting the coastal areas. We can see that the temperature is still projected to increase noticeably, the precipitation to become more volatile, especially in the south, and sea levels are projected to continue rising substantially. The next slide will show the likely consequences on economic and agriculture. Mozambique is extremely sensitive to climate change risks because its high reliance on natural resources and its critical infrastructure and population being situated along the coastal areas, which is highly vulnerable to the risks associated with climate change. In addition, adverse climate change is generally expected to impact Mozambique's hydropower capacity. We also perform a simulation analysis to understand the likely yield impact of climate change on major crops in Mozambique. And we find that maize is one of the major crops that is likely to be mostly seriously impacted relative to its production level at 2005. In 2015, maize yield is likely to reduce by roughly 15%. Next slide, please. Yeah, the Mozambique government has already taken steps to adapt to climate change. Their current prioritized areas are early warning system, food plan and biodiversity protection, food security, countering soil degradation, green innovation technologies, and climate resilience in hotspots. They also focus on limiting deforestation and have launched various initiatives to enhance its preparedness in the energy sector. Next slide, please. Yeah, based on the current status quo and our simulation analysis, we have 5 further recommendations for further actions. First, we emphasize the necessity of adoption of the agriculture sector, in particular diversification away from maize production because maize is so vulnerable to adverse climate change in Mozambique. We also stress the necessity of improvement in the climate resilience of critical infrastructure and a strategic approach to climate adoption to ensure that climate considerations are integrated in the nation's industrial strategy. We also suggest the development of technical capacity and improved access to robust, up-to-date climate projections, and further mobilize financial resources for adoption at a massive scale that can deliver a consistent and effective climate adoption response. Thanks.
So, there we go. So I'll be talking about the Kenya report. So first I'll focus on the impacts on climate. So the graph at the bottom left shows the current climate classification for Kenya. So as we can see, Kenya's land is classified as being fragile, arid, and semi-arid. And as we know, most agriculture, which is the most important economic sector, takes place in the Western Highlands near Lake Victoria and along the coast. So most of the climate models predict temperature increases across the country, although the projection models differ. So this can be seen in the bottom middle graph, which shows the expected increase in temperature across the country for the period 2020 to 2050 for 5 of the CMIP6 models under the highest global emission scenario. So as you can see from the 5 different maps from the models, temperatures across the models increase, and they range between 0.5%, which is the MPI model, and 1.5 degrees Celsius, and that is the UK model. What you can also see is that the temperatures increases differ across the different regions within the country. Future precipitation levels are highly uncertain, and that's illustrated in the bottom right graph. So from that set of graphs, 2 of the 5 models predict a decrease in precipitation and a drying in Kenya, particularly in the northwest. Again, that aligns to the sort of the part of the country where we have a lot of agricultural activity, while the other three predict an increase in precipitation. So while Kenya is typically exposed to extreme events such as droughts and floods, we have seen that over the past 3 decades, the frequency of these have increased, and it's expected to remain high and rising. So just to give some context to that, the World Bank estimates that the frequency of droughts have increased from every 2 to 3 years instead of every 5 to 10 years, while the EM data shows that floods have increased in frequency from around 3 events in each year in the 1980s to 10 events per year in the 2000s. If we move on to looking at the economic impact, climate change poses a significant threat to Kenya's economy, and that's due to the country's dependence on natural resources such as water for energy and food. So in terms of energy, particularly electricity, 1/3 of Kenya's electricity comes from hydropower, and more than 95% of agriculture is rain-fed. It's also a significant threat to Kenya's economy because of the country's dependence on climate sectors, so mainly tourism. So the graph or the table in the slide shows the impact of climate change high emission scenario, and it shows for the different crops. What we can see is that on average, crop yields are expected to increase. However, there are downside risks that exist from potentially drier climates, but then also from the rising frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. It's estimated that between 2010 and 2020, adverse climate change-related events resulted in socioeconomic losses amounting to about 3 to 5% of total GDP per annum. So that's according to the country's NDC. And then the Ministry of Environment and Forestry have also indicated that these types of extreme weather events have longer-term physical impact. We do expect to see significant regional differences across Kenya. With regards to livestock, climate change is expected to lead to heat stress, which negatively affects livestock, with disproportionate impacts expected in the SL communities. Climate change also threatens Kenya's diverse ecosystems, which have implications for the tourism industry. And so when we're thinking about all of these effects from climate change, the impacts of climate change are likely to be compounded by the already existing macroeconomic vulnerabilities that the country faces, which includes rising population and limited fiscal space. And climate change is also likely to lead to an increase in risks on the trade balance side, as well as in terms of price stability. So this slide illustrates the policy actions taken by the Kenya government in relation to climate change. So the timeline in the bottom left shows that Kenya has been a regional leader in developing policy to enable addressing climate change. And the graph on the right bottom right, shows that the climate focus has been on climate adaptation. In terms of climate adaptation projects, has been on drought specifically, and these actions that help to reduce climate vulnerability. So it's not shown here, but the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Initiative Index, which was shown for other countries, has improved for Kenya over the last decade. That being said, however, there remain challenges to country preparedness, and these are discussed in the report for Kenya in more detail. So just on the last slide, in terms of recommendations for future actions, these include improving the understanding of potential impacts of climate change in Kenya. So in our analysis of the research and looking into the work that has been done, there's more need to understand the impacts of climate change on the economy and also understand it at a more granular level, so at a sub-national level. Additional recommendations include using more precise climate scenario analysis to inform risks that are not targeted by adaptation measures. Water is very important in the Kenya economy, so ensuring effective water management, including regional cooperation, improving governmental communication and cooperation. So this was also highlighted for other countries that we had looked at. And then similarly also mobilizing funding at a sufficient scale and moving beyond the sort of current project by project approach. And then lastly, just ensuring effective implementation of adaptation measures and facilitating knowledge sharing and capacity building around the implementation of adaptation policies. So that wraps up the full country report, and I'll hand over to Wally, who will take over. Thanks.
Thank you, Faika, Juan, Aska, and Eva for sharing with us the key findings from the country report. So I would like to invite Eva once again and Chanin Ant, who is the Senior Director for Transformation Strategies at IFPRI, to share both on the climate adaptation programs for both ACF and IFPRI. So Eva, over to you.
Thank you very much, Wally. Before we begin unpacking what the reports mean in terms of, and the findings of the reports mean in terms of our future work, I just noticed that there is a hand on the floor, and I'm happy to give a moment chance for anybody to ask questions on the previous session. Felix, you have your hand up. Would you like to speak up?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, my name is Felix Gamba. Hello. I work. Hello.
Hi. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. I'm Felix Gamba. Hello. I work in Kimo County as an engineering officer. I've looked across your presentations, and I'm just trying to figure out the concentration we have, because climate change is a cross-cutting issue, and for me, from the way the angle I sit in, there are three issues of energy as very important issues on how to now address and mitigate or adapt. Because if you look at what happens, then across all sectors, whether it's agriculture, whether it's water, housing, all those issues, you will end up to either you're using energy that is not clean, or you are consuming a lot of energy. So my question is, because again, even tomorrow, I talked to one of your colleagues when we were at the Africa Climate Week Summit, I think. So one of the colleagues, we are doing a call tomorrow on how to work with our county as a local government to champion issues, how to work with our ACF to be able to bring change in terms of the sides of now energy and climate action. And what we're looking at is issues with now energy efficiency, e-mobility. I think in the building envelope, we talk about 40% global pollution levels. So I'm imagining how what you're doing. I don't know what the presentation will be, but then I'm also saying this because later on, I think around maybe from 20 minutes away, I'll be having a call, I think now with Equal Africa on something to do with mobility and issues to do with advancing climate action against. I would leave a call later on. So I was just requesting to get some insight so that as we look at working with your team, we'll see how we can be able to work together to advance some of these things. Because again, if you look at that, then the issue of now waste to energy, to talk about energy and waste and to talk about food and all those things, then how do I convert that into something productive so they don't have a lot of energy or carbon being emitted back? I wanted to see how that fits the report.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this question. We will just now unpack a little bit more the type of actions we are looking to take in addressing the recommendations of the reports, both from ACF and IFPRI perspective. And in doing so, you'll see we highlight also the need for us to collaborate and speak to various existing stakeholders that have already been working on these issues and approach the topic in a collaborative way. I'm just going to check whether, so there'll be a little bit more to my response, but I just want to check if anybody else from either ACF or IFPRI sites wanted to add anything to this, as I'm conscious that some of my connection wasn't perfect, so I might have missed some aspects of the question.
I could ask again if it was not clear.
Maybe we can, let's just, I see there is another hand. I hope that...
I think if they could write the question down in the chat, that'll be great.
Yeah, and we can pick it up as part of the Q&A in the next session, as I think it relates to that. Meanwhile, Imat, I see you have your hand up.
Oh, sorry, no, I didn't mean to raise my hand. Beg your pardon.
Ah, shame, I was looking for a question from you.
Great presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, well, maybe let's start with the next session, and then people are very welcome to write questions in the chat, and we'll pick them up at the end. So as I mentioned, the next slide, I will talk a little bit more about what, from an ACF perspective, our takeaways from the findings of the report are, and what we see as the scope of our work on adaptation. So some of the key challenges are listed on the left side. Clearly, for each of the countries, the reports highlight that the exposure to climate-sensitive sectors, such as agriculture and hydropower, is a major challenge for these economies, and requires to think beyond disaster risk management and more into how the economies need to be transformed, how these critical economic sectors can be helped to adapt to the new climate that these countries will be facing, and from our perspective, what that means in terms of our ability to empower governments with this challenge, both in terms of technical capacity, coordination capacity, and so on. Moreover, as you noticed from the presentations from me and my colleagues, there is a lot of uncertainty around climate risks. There are a lot of factors at play. It is difficult sometimes to measure. It's uncertain because we don't know in what future we'll live in. And that makes planning, strategy development, and also assessing the impacts of projects and project structuring much more challenging. So we would be, from an ACF perspective, looking to support initiatives and institutions and governments in their... We provided them technical support in their development and translation of NDCs and NAPs into investment pathways. So basically into analysis that in particular is helpful towards mobilizing funding and enabling that analytical side to support the large scale of funding that is needed for adaptation. The challenge of the current climate finance architecture is well known. It is very difficult to navigate. It can be slow, and also there are significant challenges with project bankability, especially for adaptation. And indeed, that's among the reasons why a lot of climate finance currently goes into mitigation projects. It's also the challenge that countries in Africa face coming from an emerging market context. So there is a need to complement the existing efforts in mobilizing funding, and to do so in a ways, explore ways that can do that at scale. And as Salim mentioned, look into the ways that diverse funding sources could be mobilized. How can philanthropic capital be used more effectively? How can the private sector be incentivized and also educated around or raised awareness around the need for climate adaptation and the benefits from a risk management perspective as well. And more broadly, how we can move from this project by project approach that we currently have, where certain projects, even though really important to the ability of vulnerable communities, for example, to adapt, or important to the overall economy, are struggling to get funding. Can we look through ways of a more program approach, where as a portfolio funding can be mobilized for the strategies that countries are developing? We highlighted the low adaptive capacity, which many of the countries in Africa, and including those we covered, have in tackling this real challenge that climate change presents. Some of that low adaptive capacity just stems from the numerous development priorities that they need to tackle. Some of it comes from the limited fiscal space, and indeed in climate adaptation, most funding comes from public sources, which is an issue in the context of the debt distress or near debt distress situations that many African countries are in. So how can funding be mobilized also in a way that is just structured in a more financially sustainable manner? And finally, we spoke a little bit about the need for coordination, both in terms of across ministries and also at the national and subnational level, given the dimensions of climate change and its impacts. We also mentioned, and the reports go into a lot more detail on the regional impacts of climate change, the way that adaptation strategies of one country, for example, with regards to its use of water, can have implications for their neighbors where they share the same river basin. So there is a need for adaptation to also improve regional cooperation on these matters to avoid risks of maladaptation and to find more effective ways of dealing with these challenges. So if you go to the next slide, you will see what we refer to as adaptation and resilience investment platforms. It's a concept that aims to structure our thinking and work around these areas. And it has 3 pillars. The first one captures effectively what the funding priority should be. So any work that is extends from developing the strategy to developing the investment pathways for key sectors, developing the pipeline to ensure there are actual projects that can be funded, go into this pillar. And across all these 3 pillars, there is a lot of work that is already happening and fantastic initiatives. So what our approach to this is to look into which of those should be scaled up to achieve the necessary impact, how we can support as a re-grantor good initiatives, and also how we can address any key gaps. The second pillar is about the mobilization of funding and exploring all these funding questions I just outlined into a financial package that can encompass the whole strategy and think through the most effective ways of mobilizing these resources. And then the third pillar is about the disbursement. So how are we going to make sure that the funding goes where it's intended, that the strategy has the right impact and it's effective to the projected change in climate that is expected? How do we ensure that it's implemented in a way that everyone, and especially those most vulnerable, can benefit from, and also input into it, and how we can improve overall coordination at government, but also with key stakeholders all around? These are the 3 pillars of work for an ARIP. And the next slide highlights that these platforms are meant to be nationally led platforms. It's a structure that is aimed at creating a coordination implementation vehicle, but for the efforts for adaptation. But as we have mentioned through the recommendations of the report and earlier, the need for transformational adaptation really speaks to the need for industrial policy to take into account climate change impacts. And this is why it needs to sit with governments, and governments need to be empowered to think strategically and be proactive. We are keen to not start from scratch and to build on the existing efforts and to really focus on how the first pillar, how the analytical side can really be further complemented in a way that helps with the second pillar, the funding side. This is really where we want to focus our attention. How do we get tangible solutions and real change on the ground? And that is the challenge that is true for many governments at the moment. And we want to do that by working with various organizations. And big reason why we are hosting this event is to share our work in analysis, but also to welcome you to explore together ways to collaborate and to understand from your perspective which of these areas may be most relevant to the work that your organizations do. And if you support our vision, we can discuss further how we can help achieve the level of impact that's needed. And in doing so, we want to leverage of our experience with JETPs, both the good and the bad, the lessons learned, and Salim spoke a little bit about that, and we will unpack further in the panel session. The next slide is just an illustration that we see those pillars being developed almost in parallel. They definitely need to speak and be informed in design by each other. So all I want to highlight here is this is not meant to be a time-limited initiative. It's meant to create an ecosystem of players that can throughout time support countries, and of course it will evolve from its initiation stage to the business as usual. But unfortunately, the need for adaptation and for taking into account climate change into various processes is not something that will come to an end anytime soon. So that's another aspect I wanted to highlight. I see that there are a few questions in the panel, but I want to hand over to Shanning to speak a little bit more on the how research can support these ambitions, specifically links to the first pillar of our vision, and then we can maybe take questions if there is time. So over to you, Shanning.
Thank you very much, Eva, and thank you to Salim and ACF for inviting us to join this, to being a part of this whole initiative. It's a great pleasure to be talking to everybody. So my name is Channing Arndt. I'm the Senior Director for Transformation Strategies at the International Food Policy Research Institute. We're based in Washington, D.C., but we work all over the world and have a number of offices in Africa, including in Kenya and Malawi. This whole initiative is really something that IFPRI is embracing, and in that we want the work and the research that we do to be linked to actions on the ground. And so we want the work that we're doing in terms of climate change to be demand responsive, highly collaborative, but also in working with ACF and others to make sure that it links to finance such that the investment gets going. So what I want to talk about are some national comprehensive climate change assessments, which are things that we've been doing for quite a while now. We did some in Malawi, Mozambique, and Zambia more than 10 years ago, and so there's a need to update. I'm just going to take through kind of how we do that and sort of why. So the next slide, please, is why. And I think there's a question in the chat. You know, what is going on? What's going on with the global finance system? And part of the diagnosis is that we're sort of sitting in a little bit of a vicious circle. This is a bit of a caricature, but climate finance is not slowing because of a lack of bankable investment plans. That there's not the detailed plans that people want to see. At the same time, these plans aren't coming into place because they're hard to do, and it takes a lot of resources and work. And if you're not really certain that the climate finance will actually flow, then you know, why would you undertake this plan? So that's part of the question on how to break out of this circle. And I think the ARIP concept that Eva has just gone through is really important. And these 4 case studies are meant to set a valuable baseline. They are looks at what has been done inside Kenya, Malawi, Mozambique, and Zambia, and then sort of set in place a future agenda in order to get away from a vicious circle where we're not getting climate finance, and then when we're not doing work because don't have faith we're going to get it. Where we are getting climate finance, we're gradually building up. There's projects coming online. These are successful, and they're building to greater projects. So could we go to the next slide? So the focus here is on this rigorous investment policy prioritization, and this is always necessary in that you know, there's never going to be enough money for everything that everybody wants to do. So we always have to prioritize. the level of investment, but it's particularly important now because of sort of the wide gulf between what we think is needed in terms of climate finance and what we're actually able to finance. So we want to get to the highest priority items. And this has in a way always been the case. This is not new. And so I wanted to illustrate a few tools that we use and then how we pull together these tools into something that would be more national, a National Comprehensive Climate Change Assessment, an NCCCA. So please to the next slide. So here's an example of some work that was jointly done with CGIAR in Kenya, and CGIAR is the Kenya Institute for Public Policy Research and Analysis. And at the beginning of the new government, there was a bottom-up transformation plan, and we IFPRI worked with CGIAR to try to put in what would be the implications of implementing this plan, for example, for poverty. And the thinking was that a bottom-up plan that's focused a little more on the agricultural sector, that's less top-down, might be good for poverty. And the analysis showed that to be true. So when we incorporated the elements of this plan, we ended up with 2.8 million fewer poor people in Kenya by 2027, versus a baseline run, which was kind of the standard policies. And IFPRI, the frameworks that we use give us not just poverty, but also things like GDP, jobs, the poverty gap, hunger, diet deprivation. So other indicators. Next slide, please. So continuing with Kenya, you could say, oh, well, we want to invest in bottom-up sectors. We want to perhaps invest in agriculture, but there's also a need to prioritize where exactly. You can't just say agriculture. You have to look into different sectors and value chains. And on the left, we have kind of the ranking of ag value chains in terms of their implications for an index that includes poverty, growth, jobs, and diets. And at the top of that is cattle and dairy, which provides a lot of impetus to growth, to jobs, and to diets. So this is a sector that's attractive from the perspective of driving growth, jobs, and diets. But it's not attractive in, for example, reducing poverty. Another sector, the aquaculture sector or fish, does actually, that's the gray bar, quite a good job of reducing poverty according to the model. Then we can look down and say, okay, if we're upgrading aquaculture, what exactly do we do? And we have a series of analytics that were done to look in more detail at the aquaculture sector. So this is kind of the investment prioritization that we traditionally do and have been doing for quite some time. And if we go to the next slide. At its base is a tool that Asker mentioned, which is a sort of an economy-wide look, a look at the whole economy and a series of tools that run around it in terms of investment tools, value chains, with implications for the agri-food system, for infrastructure, and then we can get to what it means for households and welfare. We have this sort of framework available in 35 countries, 32 developed, 33 underdeveloped, 3 under development, but all 4 of the countries in which the case studies were undertaken, as well as many others on the African continent. It's a full sector. It's the entire economy, so services, manufacturers, industry, electricity, but a lot of detail in the food system, which is normally where more than half of the labor force is actually employed and working. And we run, of course, all the way from agriculture to food services. So this is the investment priority, one of the main investment prioritizations tools that we use to look at levels of investment across the country and to try to prioritize in that way. When we add in climate, let's go to the next slide. We put, and you can see the red box on the right is the national modeling approach, but we add in at the top, and we call this a climate integrated assessment model. We add in climate, we add in weather. We could do work on crops, we do work on animals, water, land, transport, energy. We can look at regional issues and look at the national. And the whole point here is that there are, as many of the presenters were emphasizing, there's a considerable range of potential climate outcomes. Some are more variable, some are less variable, some involve more precipitation, others involve less precipitation. So trying to comprehensively look across, okay, what are the ranges of possible outcomes so that we're not investing in the wrong way. Also, these different outcomes have different implications for different sectors. So this is another reason to look comprehensively. Something that's bad for crops might not be so bad for the transport sector, for example. And what the implications are for hydropower might be quite different for that, for animal, the livestock sector. Relatives matter. Just because even if climate change is reducing productivity or reducing productivity across a couple of sectors, one that's relatively declining relatively less might be favored. So there are also opportunities, and as was pointed out in some cases, for example, in Kenya, yields can go up in substantial regions of the country, and you'll want to be able to take advantage of that. So these are resilience and investment platforms, that the ARIPs, and so these risk-based approaches are important for assessing vulnerability and getting to resilience. So this also involves, what is the most important impact channel? Is it your processing industries? Is it your fundamental agriculture? Is it roads? Is it mainly flooding? And that then will help to lead to the development of investment and policy priorities. So back down to the next slide, please. So here's an example of some of the risk-based work that, and Asker referred to this. This is a fairly complicated chart, but it's a good example of thinking about climate change in a context and at a broad level of choice. And Asker mentioned this in his presentation on Malawi. But if you're investing into agriculture, then you would be growing the agricultural sector. That's the idea. And the agricultural sector is more vulnerable to climate change than, say, textiles or some other non-agricultural sectors. So you have this complicated decision. You have a lot of people in agriculture. You have a sector that's climate sensitive. You have climate change coming that makes the extreme events more likely. Do you invest into or out of agriculture? And the charts are complex, but basically they're saying that, yes, investing in agriculture expands the variation in outcomes that you're likely to get, but it's still a very effective means for reducing poverty and for driving income growth, especially amongst the lower income sets of the population. So there's still a serious role for investment in agriculture and in the food system in order to confront climate change and to reach development outcomes. So these are the kinds of things that we're able to look at, and that we hope can form an integral part of an investment plan that mobilizes finance. So let's move to the final slide. So this is just to wrap up. It's the same thing: how to break out solid plans to get into a virtuous circle of rigorous investment policy prioritization, contemporaneous at the same time efforts to mobilize finance, making sure that we're aware of implementation constraints, that we actually get things going, and then illustration that these projects are on the ground moving and we're monitoring, evaluating, learning from them, which gives us a need or an ability to look at the investments and policy prioritizations again, move forward, mobilize finance, and try to achieve that last way or that way. So I think that the main conclusion is that these national comprehensive climate change assessments done collaboratively can be a part of this solution of moving forward to getting finance to flow into slots with high impact. So thank you very much for your time and attention. I will pass back to Eva.
Thank you very much, Shanning. We are in time for our panel discussion, but I did want to address quickly the questions in the chat box, and other questions could be asked to the panel as well as we go towards the end of this session. So first, there was a question from Salim around the choice of countries and whether there will be others. The choice of these countries was, as I mentioned, partially because they illustrate different cases for adaptation, both in terms of the climate change impact and what it means for the respective economies. It really shows that there is a need for an ARIP to be country specific and for tangible solutions to take into account how different situations are, even if at the high level there are similarities in the challenges that climate change presents. It was also informed by the work of IFPRI to date and available research, but it's by no means meant to be the end of our exploratory work. There could definitely be others. For us, what is important is to work with governments where there is enabling environment, where there is a desire to take action and to adapt the economy, and that for us is the most important factor and the kind of efforts we are keen to support. So watch this space, but these have been our pilot countries. The other question was around, very good question, around how exactly what for us means to move resource mobilization at scale. Thank you, Irene, for asking this question, and also what activities or strategies we are looking at. So the challenges with the global banking architecture are indeed well recognized, and it's a big challenge to think through innovative ways, of course. Our starting point is that when thinking about funding on a project by project basis, on this grassroots way that currently is dominating, there are important strategic decisions that may be omitted, and certain investments may not fully make sense out of context. The investment proposition can be different when you can see an entire sector transformational pathways and see why certain projects are important as part of a broader context. It also, so we're keen to work with governments because it can provide that perspective to investors, and in doing so, base the need for, as Shanning mentioned, the need to prioritize more, to identify key areas to target, do so in as where possible in more no regret way, and really show that there is political backing to that course of action. These are things that can appeal to an investor, but of course there is a need to also improve engagement on that portfolio scale, so rather than with individual projects. And I mentioned the JETP experience. So for those that may not be familiar with the acronym, this stands for just Energy Transition Programs. For example, there is one in South Africa and other countries as well. And what they have aimed to achieve in the mitigation space is provide this big picture on how a country plans to transition. What does that mean? Also more specifically in terms of the transition pathways, and have been able to achieve pledges from different funders who support that effort. Now, those pledges are, they're not at their first form funding to specific projects, but they do create incentives for additional work. And then there is a matching mechanism to convert those pledges into actual funding. The reality is that there is a lot of complexity and gaps still to be filled. Some may be on the strategy side, some may be on the pipeline development, some may be on the project structuring side. Adaptation is a big undertaking that will take time, but going through these efforts in a way that speaks to different types of funders and getting on board different types of funders, as earlier explained, and being able to tap into sources that may not have been available on a project by project basis. This is what we are aiming to help facilitate. But let me now stop here and pass to the panel discussion, because I hope that can further provide some clarity and explore together indeed how can we change the global banking architecture. Alan, I hand over to you for that.
Thank you, Eva, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alan Wallace. I work with the African Climate Foundation, and if I could clap or push a clap button, I think you can all agree that the presentations so far have been really excellent, and it's a testament to the amount of work that has gone into it and the complexity that we're all trying to grapple with. But I also think it's a great break now to go from a lot of information and sort of, let's go, a bit of an overload. And I'm going to invite my panelists for today to turn on their cameras. I'm going to call Andrew Jamali, David Kaluba, and Deshika Naidu, to go from the research to practitioners, to people who are working in their respective governments around how to turn this type of research into the goal that we're trying to achieve, which is to mobilize the financing necessary. Because I think one thing that's come out very clearly is that we know that climate change is going to have severe impacts on our economies. And the knock-on effects, both social and economic, from trade, etc., create this cycle. We also know that climate finance is not flowing. And I think there is a degree of fatigue around plans and more work on adaptation, because if those flows aren't following the amount of work that's going in, we're starting to see a plateau of efforts. And we just have to look at the adaptation gap report, which was released by UNEP last week, really painting quite a grim picture in terms of adaptation flows. And they even mentioned saying that even if we were to reach the goal on doubling adaptation finance, we would only close the financing gap by 5 to 10%. So it's a very worrying future that we're not seeing these flows. And so how do you then start approaching these issues? So before I start, I'm going to briefly introduce you to our panel. We're joined by Andrew Jamali. Andrew joins us from Malawi. He's the research manager at the National Planning Commission in Malawi. We are also joined by Deshika Naidu. Deshika joins us from the Presidential Climate Commission in South Africa, where he's the World Bank Senior Advisor and Climate Adaptation Lead. And then finally, we're joined by David Kaluba from Zambia, who works with NDC Partnership and is the in-country facilitator in the Ministry of Green Economy and Environment. And David also has extensive experience in climate finance and adaptation work. So to kick us off, Andrew, I think you've heard a lot of information. You're on the ground, and I'm going to ask for you to say, what has Malawi's experience been, and what challenges have you faced in funding the adaptation strategy, given the amount of work that's gone into Malawi's plans? And then secondly, what in your opinion would be most helpful to unlocking the necessary scale of funding in the future?
Thank you so much, Alan, and thank you so much, colleagues, for an extensive and very comprehensive piece of work, which is kind of illuminating in terms of understanding the implications of prevailing, climatic conditions, both now and in the future, and how they pan up in terms of development processes within the countries affected. What's been our experience in terms of climate financing? I mean, as a country, we are still in a very precarious situation in terms of resources mobilization, even for prioritized development interventions. You might recently realize that we came up with our new vision, and our previous national adaptation plan is yet to be aligned to the aspirations of the vision, although the key aspects of the adaptation plan speaks to most of the broader intentions in terms of activities to operationalize the vision. But Malawi is in a precarious state in terms of climatic discussion, climatic issues discussion, because in the past 3 years, we have had wave after wave of this negative climatic feedback. And every plan that comes on the desk is met with an equal kind of challenge, because the intensity and the scale of these climatic, mishaps is kind of increasing and pretty much challenging the planning, capacities within our, development, prioritization and planning spaces. We can talk about the barrage of cyclones that we've had over the past 3 years, the latest of which is Cyclone Freddy, which has had massive infrastructure damages, not to mention the fact that there's been lots of fatalities and a costly experience in terms of human capital formation and processes along those lines. The immediate concern for government and many of the partners is to mount an appropriate response to address the immediate implications of this climatic, negative climatic feedback. And a lot more resources obviously will be channeled towards cooling the system, if I may be allowed to use that word, because if you talk about the recent experiences with climate Freddy, the infrastructure damage, we are not yet recovered from that. We're still having problems with our power generation. It's basically hydro-oriented. We're having challenges with infrastructure, rehabilitation, and our export capacity has actually dwindled because we've lost a lot of productivity, productive investments in the long run. So if government is to allocate appropriate funding to adaptation, first things first is to restore the status quo, making sure that people have got appropriate housing, they have appropriate food, and then building their capacities to withstand any event that might likely recur relating to climatic, negative climatic feedback. Over and above that, our debt levels are not sustainable. We are really facing a huge public debt, which continues to rise by the hour because recently there are also cholera outbreaks that kind of relate to prevailing climatic conditions. We're having El Nino conditions as I speak, too much warming, and all that is complicating a proper mounting of financing strategy for adapting to these persistent and overly challenging climatic feedbacks. So that's the context of Malawi. The next question is about how are we navigating through that terrain? Well, as a government, obviously, we will have to engage in extensive discussion with researchers and planners in the space to come up with appropriate, if at all, matched response to these immediate, to address the immediate problems that have actually hit Malawi as a result of climate change. In terms of climate financing, it's still public oriented. We have an appropriate, government appropriated since 2020, at least 1% of GDP to fighting, climate change, related effects and impacts. But that's just not even a drop. It's the extensive damages, the extensive demand for restoration and rehabilitation doesn't match up with the GDP. And suffice to mention that the fact that our GDP, our productive capacities have been eroded entails that our GDP may not be good enough to sustain such kind of demands. So what do we do about it? I think much of it all is relying on, impactful collaboration with development partners who would be much more willing to offset the gap that government might be experiencing in its programs to address these kind of challenges. So constant engagement with development partners, the UN systems and other supporting agencies is something that is on the table through and through. But over and above that, we are also extending our tentacles within the private sector space, whereby we would want to leverage on the potential support from the private sector, knowing that cautiously, so to speak, most of these climatic feedback are an influence of private sector interventions. I'm saying cautiously because Malawi's contribution to the carbon footprint out there, it could be negligible. And the fact that, a mess that is happening in this spatial locale would have its impact on another spatial locale makes it complex for people to take or institutions to take responsibility. So that's another political economy context, because private sector is capital oriented, it's profit oriented. And to talk about them really addressing the challenges that they may not have contributed to is also another tall communication beat that needs to be addressed. But the short of it is that government is taking steps to ensure that in conversation about climate change, adaptation and mitigation measures, private sector entities are involved, because we know that they have the muscle to support any other initiative that government could be putting in place. The other tricky thing, which is highlighted in our national research agenda, is coming up with innovative funding models for climate financing. And that's something that our researchers in the space really are getting preoccupied with. And I'm happy that IFPRI has put up its footprint in terms of coming up with this kind of research. We need models that are sustainable, models that are impactful, and models that would really create the much needed transformation in terms of climate financing. And that is not something that can be just done overnight. It cannot be done by one entity. There's need for more engagement, more conversation around these issues. But suffice to mention that we have as much information about the projections about climatic outcome or climatic outlook in as far as the country is concerned, even up to 2050, 2060. So we have a fair view of what we are likely to face, but we do not have a clear outline of a matched approach to addressing the effects that are associated with that kind of outlook. Efforts are being undertaken by government, policy measures in place, programmatic interventions in place, but also strengthening the partnerships that should be there to address funding challenges within the context of climate change in Malawi. I think I'll stop it there for the time being. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And I think there's a couple of things which I think are really important. One is the data and the work that's being done, and that translation of the type of data and the modeling into investments that can attract different sources of finances, but which are ultimately not flowing. And I think you mentioned the private sector, and that's one space in climate finance where the private sector is not as present as we see in mitigation efforts. But there is a vested interest in the private sector in ensuring economic and natural assets are protected. So is there a narrative dimension there and how we get the private sector more involved? It might not be at every stage in a blended bucket, but there are certain private sector interests which would be more viable to a private sector investor than, say, a public investor. I also think that it's critical that you mentioned fiscal space and debt, and the adaptation gap report, and we know that the majority of adaptation finance, it's not sufficient, but it's also majority loans. So it's taking on additional debt to solve problems that to solve problems that are going to sort of exacerbate the situation. So I think this idea of also innovative financing models, and when we're talking about the global financial architecture and looking at both the quantum and the quality of finance is absolutely critical. So I think these are all really important dimensions, and how do we get everyone around the table? So maybe I'll ask you to just respond to that, and then I'm going to move on to Deshigan. So yeah, Andrew, I see your hand is back up again.
No, I think it should be a legacy hand that shouldn't be there.
Oh, legacy hand. Okay. Great. Deshigan, I'm going to move on to you. And now, so Deshigan, you're from South Africa. Not part of the study of reports, but as mentioned, is that the type of thinking we're doing should or we think resonate with any country. I think grappling with how to manage this adaptation and raise financing. So maybe I'll ask you two questions. First is just reflecting on the types of findings coming out and response to adaptation. Maybe how South Africa is approaching this issue. I know that the country's busy building its own investment plan. But I'd also like us to loop back around to the JETP, the Just Energy Transition Partnership, which was mentioned earlier. And although that was, let's say, a front loading of a pledge of $8.5 billion for energy and mitigation, does that model hold any lessons that could be applied or replicated in the context of adaptation? Thank you. Over to you, Dishkin.
Thank you, Ellen, and thank you, everyone. Firstly, congratulations to ACF and your partners. I think this is very innovative analysis, an analysis I think that is really, really important and much needed right now. And the ARIP model is something that I think deserves very close study. I think it has the fundamental pillars that we should be looking at. And I think that organizing for this to go beyond the traditional discussions around climate finance is incredibly useful because it's talking about the enabling conditions for sustainability. So well done on that, and well done on organizing for us to have an African discussion on this, which I think is really vital. A few small points before I answer your question more directly. I think that the African climate conversation is in a better space than it has ever been. And I would argue that as a region, currently one of the more vibrant ones in the world. And Africa Climate Week this year, which included the inaugural African Climate Summit, was pretty powerful. So I think African colleagues, while we have a higher mountain to climb than many other parts of the world, I think we already are on a pretty reasonable trajectory around the political momentum, at the very least, that we are putting into it. And I think this is really important. But let me talk about the South African experience, and I want to return a little bit later to the African experience. So South Africa has had a very interesting starting point on this chapter of the journey. Like many other places on the continent, we've been dealing with adaptation measures for the longest time. And many of our countries are either extremely dry, like mine is, or very prone to floods, like many other parts of the continent. And certainly the storm surges on Africa's east coast have become legendary with time. So we've been adapting to this for decades, if not centuries, yeah? And the new labels that we have around this, and labels are really important around this accelerated climate change impact on the world, now at 1.15 degrees above pre-industrial levels, is showing us how bad this can get. And we have major hotspots on this continent, some of which are not reflected in the conversation today, but we have to look to them as markers for where we need to go. I will talk about two very quickly that aren't in this conversation. One is the Horn of Africa. The other one is the Lake Chad Basin. And these are incredible climate hotspots. And they're showing us very interesting things about how to use the climate argument to resolve a whole range of other issues. And I'll return to that in a bit. So let me first talk about the South African experience and the starting point about where we are now. We started off with the thing called the Just Transition Framework. And this is critically important because it set out the principal foundation upon which we want to do all of our climate work going into the future. Now, it's particularly important for a country like South Africa, which is a high carbon economy. You know that, we can't hide that. And so its transition to a low carbon economy is probably starker than most of Africa, apart from two other countries who are roughly in the same boat that we are. And this is really important. And what that did is a couple of things. The first thing that it did is it opened a public conversation and created the environment for us to be engaging around the notion of change. And change is absolutely critical. We simply cannot do the things that we used to do. And even the things that we carry on doing, we have to do them very differently. And this is paramount. The second thing is starting off with the energy sector. And the energy sector drivers in the South African environment are about two things, let us be clear. One is the carbon ambition, as we expressed it in the NDC. But the other ambition that we have around an investment in lower carbon energy solutions is, in fact, energy security in South Africa. We have an energy poverty currently. We need much more energy for our growth ambitions going into the future. And this is something that has been a strong driver around organizing for a more logical mix of energy options in our, what we call the IRP, the integrated planning, resource planning. which is our broader energy plan. And what that is doing is opening up a series of opportunities with this diversity around investment. And the thing that it has brought into the fray, which is a really important learning from the JETP, the Just Energy Transition Partnership, is what it takes to open the doors for private sector finance and investment to come into the frame. So building on that base, we are now engaging with what we are calling the Just Adaptation and Resilience Investment Plan, the JAR IP. You have an AR IP. We have a J in front of that for the justice component. But a few things related to that I think are important for this conversation. Number one, the paradigm matters. It really matters. A lot of the conversation that's happening in the developing world in particular is related to surviving the extreme weather in particular, but also the global heating, because the global heating is leading to a range of problems associated with our economies. Now, if we are in survival mode, then the things that become paramount are things like the aid distribution from the north and the 100 billion target. And those are not unimportant. But they're not the mechanism that's going to get the investment that is required. If we, however, take a growth and development perspective on climate resilience, it opens a range of new doors around what we need to do. And I think this is something that we really need to be looking at very, very clearly. Because the bottom line around this is when we compare resilience of the richer countries with the poorer countries in the world, it really amounts to two things. It amounts to, one, do you have the infrastructure that will allow you to recover rapidly from an extreme weather event? And two, do you have the resources to pay for it? And one interesting comparison from a decade and a bit ago is the earthquake that happened in Haiti. And Haiti is still struggling to recover from that earthquake. And the current timeline is something close to 300 years before it gets to the same level that it was before the earthquake, compared to a couple of months later, where we had an earthquake and a tsunami in Japan. And within 2 months, it was back to 90% functionality. So the climate resilience interventions that we require are really based in those spaces. Do we have the infrastructure that is sufficiently climate resilient to, one, withstand these conditions when these extreme weather events happen, and two, to be able to recover from it? And the other point is there a sufficiency in the resource base? And what that really amounts to, and I was quite intrigued by Channing's charts, and I hope we were able to get a copy of that report, is the close relationship between your climate resilience levels inside the system and, more than survival, but the growth and development prospects that exist inside your system. So the one thing that you have to do fairly early on around climate adaptation financing and planning is to organize for a convergence between your climate responsiveness as well as your SDG agenda, and I would argue even beyond that, with your own growth aspirations wherever you are. Now, this should happen at national levels, and the interweaving is complicated, but it has to be done. But this should also happen at supranational levels. So one of the things that we did together with the ACF, actually, in Africa Climate Week is examining Agenda 2063. And Agenda 2063 is a powerful ambition for the African continent. And what we need, we have concluded in that event and the analysis that has happened before and after that event, is that we need to get to a climate resilient Agenda 2063, if you like, Agenda 2063 2.0. And the reason why we need to bring all of these things together is that we expand the possibilities of the envelopes of funding that become available. Funding and resourcing, I should add, because not everything's about money. And here, and we're happy to contribute this to our partners in Africa. We've been examining these issues. One is we need new ways of engaging the issues of adaptation costing. And we've worked out what we think is a clever little algorithm around how to do this. And this framework is published on the PCC website, but for those who can't get it there, we're happy to get it to you. The second piece of work that we're currently completing is around engaging what are the innovative mechanisms for resourcing adaptation. Now, some of it will come from this convergence with the SDG and the development plan agenda, and those mechanisms would be very powerful. But there's a subset of adaptation that is only about climate change, and this is a reality. And in order for us to get over that hump, there are very particular things that we need to do. And these innovative mechanisms, and these reports should be available within the next 3 to 4 months, and we will happily make it available via the ACF to our other African partners, are things to look at. It's not only about the direct financing, it's not only about the debt capital, it is about organizing for different incentives for investment and business and enterprise development inside the system that will be very powerful. But there are some very important differences between the energy transition and the broader transition associated with adaptation. Firstly, the dividend timetable is completely different. Adaptation has a huge lag phase. You will put in the intervention now, you will see the dividend on that intervention when you manage your next extreme weather event better than you're managing the current ones. And more so, if you're dealing with the issues of incremental rises in temperature, you're going to see incremental dividend coming out of that. It means that the capital that goes into the adaptation game has to have a much higher patience coefficient than what is happening in the energy transition. The reality is in the energy transition is almost immediate. If you're an energy poor country, as South Africa currently is, then your dividend is immediate when that starts generating. If you're generally energy poor, as Africa generally is, that dividend will come very quickly indeed. So the adaptation is a lot longer, but not always. Not always, because I think the other thing that's been pulled out in the analysis, which is absolutely critical, is using sectoral markers around this. So if you have climate smart agriculture as a major part of your adaptation intervention, you're going to see this season by season, because next season's crops are not going to fade away on the back of a drought like the current season's crops, because you're using different cultivars, you're using different irrigation techniques, you may be farming undercover, which means the protection factor that you're giving, the climate resilience that you are now introducing into the system can also have a short-term effect. This will also be true around water availability, for example. So it's not about everything. The other point that I want to make into this thing is that as we move from this paradigm of avoiding loss, which is the current dominant conversation around climate adaptation, into the realm of economic potential, we will also then start knocking on the door of co-benefits. Now, some of these will be short-term co-benefits, some of them are investments in much longer term. So some of the things that come into this frame that are absolutely critical are issues associated with where global markets are going. And global markets are very sensitive around carbon. And as climate change practitioners, we're very happy about that. But the potential negative impacts associated with new trade rules that organize themselves around a carbon marker will mean that if you are not in that game, your products and services will not be able to go to global markets. This is a very big issue for Africa, that we need to really organize ourselves into that frame as quickly as possible. So all of this together, and I'll pause in a moment, all of this together says 2 or 3 things. The first of those things is that we have to deal with a core socioeconomic change in the system as one of the fundamental things we want to move. And moving to a climate resilient society may mean, if we do it the right way, moving to more equitable societies and more prosperous societies. The second thing that we have to put in the plate, and I want to repeat what has been said before, is fiscal funding. Public sector funding is an unavoidable leverage to bring other players into the game. Alan, let me pause there.
Thank you so much, Deshka. I think it's a lot of food for thought, and I think the frames you've challenged us on one, moving from a survival mode to a view to growth and development, and avoiding the loss narrative and looking at economic potential and that ability to move to co-benefits. That I think it captures this notion from moving from incremental to more transformative adaptation, and I think this is that underlines that notion. So I think based on those, I'm going to ask David to join us. And David, just lost my question there. So when we talk about investment plans, and the reports recommend developing investment plans, and in Zambia, you, I think, spent a lot of time on investment plans, both in Zambia and more broadly around raising adaptation finance. What do you think we should be thinking about more when looking at investment plans, and how Zambia going about this? Because Zambia has done also a lot of work in this space.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alan, for the invitation, and also for this excellent analytical work that you have done with IFPRI and others. Yeah, I'm sure we'll benefit a lot from those products. Yeah, I shared the presentation, but I'll not go through it. I'll go directly to just respond to your question. Well, we have gone through a long journey as a country in the climate change landscape. And of course, one of the major issue has been around working through the coordination of climate change implementation across different sectors, different players in the private sector, in the civil society organizations, and provinces and so on, up to the local levels. So that has been a constant issue over time. The other one has been of course, consolidating on the mobilization of resources. We have attempted to implement some, if you like, large-scale adaptation projects, such as the pilot program for climate resilience, which has been since been scaled up. But a larger chunk of that, and of course, in the first phase, we had some grant financing, but now we have gone into the loan portfolios, especially in the second phase of the scaling up of these initiatives. And as you know, Zambia is dealing with this debt stress, and a large part of this call for the transformation of the financial international financial architecture. We are renegotiating our debt with lenders. We are almost getting there. It has been a challenge, and the idea is to free up the fiscal space for financing developmental activities, including climate change projects in the country. So as far as we are concerned, we have done our part in terms of developing the appropriate tools that will help us to position ourselves to overcome some of these challenges. First, from the 8th National Development Plan, which is quite comprehensive and has integrated climate change considerations significantly. I think one of the best since we began to try to deal with this mainstreaming of climate change. We have a chapter dealing with environmental sustainability there, and elaborating more on the issues of adaptation and mitigation. We have, as you mentioned, developed the NDC implementation framework, which is also guiding the implementation of various commitments that Zambia has made for the Paris Agreement in terms of enhancing ambition. So we have articulated the priority sectors on mitigation and adaptation. And we have also just completed developing the National Adaptation Plan, which will be launched, I think, tomorrow. Or actually, we launched on the 14th of November, with a very expansive, or at least detailed adaptation, elaboration of adaptation, actions that the country intends to implement. So I think it's this is where we are. So I think, in as far as creating enabling environments, developing tools, and being ready for implementation, we have done significant work, and I think that we are ready to channel out various opportunities that we have highlighted in the energy sector, in the transport sector, in agriculture, water, forestry, and many others. We are ready to also engage with the private sector, with different partners like yourselves, in taking some of the work forward, whether as technical assistance, or as grant financing, or as business opportunities for those with the greater capacities to invest in renewable energies and many others. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David. And I know you shared a presentation, but I think time has not been on our side today. But thank you so much for that. But I think really hearing about the NAP coming out and the implementation plan, and maybe one more question. I think as Zambia is at this key moment in terms of its policy instruments that are emerging, what would the immediate next step be? Who needs to get around the table? And what I said, how do we avoid the lag from plan to implementation that we often see around adaptation? And if you could wave your wand, what would you hope to see?
I think it's the partnership with stakeholders that are ready to support Zambia, package different either concepts, project proposals, feasibility financing for some of these initiatives, and as it were, bankable proposals that will be attractive to private sector. So those are crucial. We're also looking at expanding our reach, to sources of financing, such as the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, and the JEF and many others where the opportunities avail themselves. So what we know is that there is a limited space for accessing these funds, and that is why this larger international financial architecture is important for us to achieve scale, and scale which we will not as it were put Zambia again into a debt stress scenario where we are coming from. So I think those are the immediate steps I can think about. So we need greater engagement with partners. We are inviting partners to come on board. We are sharing the instrument for that partnership, and our Minister of Green Economy and the Environment has been very, very vocal and very active in the space, including the President, as most of you have noted, very actively engaged in the international platforms to attract investments into the country that is low cost, and this involves the role of the private sector in taking up some of these public or private public partnership initiatives. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much. And I know we've reached time, and no questions have come up, but I do want maybe just to maybe as we close out the session, and I really hope that people on the call who have questions will stay in touch with ACF and IFPRI and keep this conversation going. But maybe to each of our panelists, I said we've come from the African Climate Summit. We're less than a month away from COP. What, as Africa, should we be going into or asking for in this space, or what is the key message around adaptation and finance? So maybe, Andrew, I'll go back to you to start us off, maybe 1 minute, just to say, looking forward to COP and beyond, what Africa should be asking for.
Right. Thank you very much. Sorry for the echoes. Look, I think for the countries that have been under this range of studies that IFPRI and colleagues have really been working on, you can see some similarities in terms of the experiences. The key sectors that are being affected by these climatic, events are the same. The implications on perhaps maybe growth and livelihoods, pretty much the same. The effects are kind of, rounded up to be the same. And a chorus is needed as Africa presents itself at the COP that is unified enough to advance an appropriate, thought that should make those that have got the power to move things in terms of financing to really see the need for that. So a unified voice within the regional perspective approach, looking at the fact that our concerns are pretty much similar and the same. How that can be done, it's something that could be up for discussion. But I know that if you want to take a long journey, then you better move with a partner. So that is something that I would want to stress as we're moving forward, looking up to COP. Secondly, I think the whole issue of rearranging the governance space with regards to climate financing, or pretty much climate response, is very important. Why is that key? Particularly for Malawi, there are conflicting priorities in terms of development. And these are coming in because of agitation that could be in the space. The economy is not performing that well. So the key concern would be how do we bring the. But even as we think about those kind of quick fix measures to broad-based problems like the economy, we will have to think about that within the confines of prevailing triggers to that, which climate change is a major culprit in that respect. So bringing a conversation to governments, desks, that would make the people in the levers of power to see appropriate investment in adaptation and resilient programming across the key productive sectors of the economy is also something that we need to emphasize. Because as we speak, politicians are looking at their watches and they're asking themselves how much more time do we have to sit on these benches in Parliament. They're chasing different ambitions, different values, so to speak. As government technicians like myself, we're looking at how the plans that we have put in place for government to transform Malawi to become a lower middle income economy by 2030 are really bearing their actual fruit. But as we see, things are not the way we wanted them to be. So a proper conversation between those that are sitting on policy desks, the technocrats, and proper prioritization that is evidence-based, which is what we've witnessed this afternoon, would be a much more desired step towards working things together to address the climatic challenge issues. Over and above that, I would like to stress the need for also development partners to come around to shape the conversation in a direction of change. Because as we speak, we all know that development partners also have their own interests. But how much of these interests are galvanized around the key triggers of what we see as problems in the country is also something we need to really think about. And research and engagement plays a critical role. That extends to the private sector. That needs to be thoroughly undertaken. Malawi is not falling short of policy documents or strategic frameworks about addressing these challenges. It's the implementation bit that's the problem. And I see that much of it is coming from poor kind of framing of priorities, poor kind of engagement with appropriate figures that could transform the status quo to what we all desire. Getting up to COP, strengthening the regional perspective of how we can adapt to climatic challenges, rallying around together with private sector organizations to address those challenges, but also towing in the same direction with development partners. That requires excellent kind of engagement and communication to make things move. Thank you, Ellen.
Thank you, Andrew. I think a number of really powerful points there, and I think both sort of short-term, medium-term, and long-term. Deshigan, 1 minute before we've kept everyone here for the last 2 hours, so I'll ask you to inspire us in 60 seconds. Oh, and you're on mute.
I'll confine my comments to COP28. I'll push 3 things. One is that we have to keep the momentum up on the loss and damage fund. It was a big gain at 27 in Cairo. It's a horse that needs a lot of guidance to get it to where it needs to be. The interim arrangement that was converged in Abu Dhabi is far from ideal. Far from ideal. This whole notion of a voluntary fund is very difficult for a continent like Africa. It's difficult for most of the developing world, actually. And this is something I think our leaders, and there will be a summit segment, need to be much more vocal about and really guide from the beginning of the COP how those negotiations will go. The second is we need an acceleration on the global goal for adaptation. It's been lying on the back burner for 4 COPs now without significant momentum. And we're hopeful that 28 is going to give it the kickstart that it seriously needs. And then related to that, the whole ratio of adaptation funding as it compares itself to mitigation funding, not stealing from one for the other. But I mean, we need funding overall to be increased in a significant way. But the ratio that's going to adaptation is far too little to do anything significant with. And the third one, which sounds like an outlier, but I think an important one, and something that, because Africa has to go there not just asking for what other folk can do. I mean, Africa has to say, look, one, if you don't help us to do this, your emission status is going to be nothing compared to the African emission status in the next decade. Because if we're forced to use our fossil fuel asset to develop, to prevent our people from falling into poverty, to prevent us from going into a demographic burden with our youthful continent, then this is what we're going to have to do. So if you really are interested in organizing for a global low-carbon economy, then keep our emission status below 4% because we can get to 40%. And this requires an investment. And the second part of that, I think Africa should put out there that the resources you need to make all of this happen is in this continent. We hold 60% of all the critical minerals that are required to power this renewable energy economy. We want to be a player in that game. And I think if we make that point at 28, I think it paves the way on how we can do it in the other fora that matter. Thank you. I'll pause there.
There's again. David, I'm going to give you the last word, and then we're going to let everyone go and digest. But anything from your side before we wrap up?
Yeah, well, I think the previous speakers have said almost everything. The COP28 is important. Loss and damage. We're just coming from Abu Dhabi. I was part of the team that was doing this final governing instrument. I agree with Dr. Naidu that we were not happy at all. Nobody's happy, but we have taken that to the next step. Let's see what happens. So yeah, the global goal on adaptation is important. We have the global stocktake, which is going to, at least help us to understand what has happened and also to chart the best way forward. And I think it's important to emphasize that that COP28, that sustainable development should be a substantial part of the agenda, or part of the emphasis of the global stocktake, because this is what Africa needs. Africa needs to utilize its resources, as we have pointed out well. Africa needs to transition in a more on a less costly manner. We are accumulating debt, and that debt is choking us. We need to have a right blend of the ambition as well as the resources. So that will be an important part of the whole package that will come out of COP28. So I think these are my few reflections. Otherwise, I think the importance of investments cannot be emphasized. Actually, if you look at the UNCTAD report, Africa is a net contributor to the world, if you put it that way, because more money is getting out of the continent than the amount of money coming in. So that loophole needs to be closed, but maybe not in the context of the COP, but in the other discussions, in the larger international financial architecture discussions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And I think I'm going to say thank you so much. I'm going to hand back to Eva. I know we've gone over maybe to close out, but from my side, a big thank you to our panelists. I know it's a busy time, less than a month away from COP. We're all running on a treadmill, but Eva, over to you maybe to close us off. Yeah.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today and allowing us to have this helpful discussion. And I hope we'll have many more. And with that, hope to see you again. Bye.